All right, so that's our reading. And this last piece of it in chapter 10 is obviously a very troubling, painful reading. At the moment of expected celebration, in the midst of celebration, right, the tabernacle is inaugurated, the fire comes forth, the presence of Adonai appears to the people, the burnt offering is consumed, right, and there is what should be great joy. And then two of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, do something. We don't know exactly what was involved in this. It is described very tersely as they each took their fire pan, put fire in it, put incense on it, and they offered Eish Zara, alien fire, which Adonai had not commanded them, or which had been explicitly commanded not to do. We don't know. And they are killed on the spot. Immediately. Moses offers in this moment a very cryptic response. Moses says to his brother Aaron, this is what Adonai meant when God said, through those near to me I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people. It's not clear exactly what that means. None of the commentators have any clue when did God exactly say this and what did God mean by this. And there are interpretations of it that see it to the merit of Nadav and Avihu. It's cryptic. And in response, Vayidom Aharon. Aaron was silent. So, the plain meaning of this, right? The moment that this represents is truly shocking. And one of the most powerful commentaries is, I think this is a Bravanel, I've seen it attributed to Ramban. I actually can't find it in the Ramban, so I'm guessing a Bravanel is the more correct citation. This is not a usual refraining from speech. Vayidom is a deep, deep silence. And the Bravanel reads, Aaron's heart, his heart was turned upside down, and he became like a lifeless stone. The shock of this loss is an assault on humanity. Right, we become Aaron in the immediacy of this loss. Is not only doesn't speak, he becomes like an inanimate object who cannot speak. Right, and I imagine that those of us here in this congregation who have endured the loss of a child understand exactly what this means. Chas v'shalom. Right? It's a horror. And I want to say that it is a horror not only because of the horror of a moment like this and the human condition of Aaron losing two sons in the course of his service to God, but the shock of the narrative is heightened by the vast majority of commentators who attribute the deaths of Nadav and Avihu to divine punishment for sin. And I think we viscerally, most if not all of us, viscerally recoil from the very idea of that. How could that be? How could it be that God just strikes down two human beings for a sin of what? Whatever they did, right? What could it mean? And we read over and over in the text that follows, right? Lest you die. We just read it a couple of times. Don't drink anything if you're going to serve in the lest you die, right? I think when we encounter Torah texts that seem to suggest such harsh punishment from God, we react against them. We want to limit them or reinterpret them or contextualize them or turn them into a metaphor or explain them away, or just outright reject them. This is not how any God that we could believe in would behave. And I want to say rightly so. Rightly so. Right? It is not something that we want to lift up and admire, and certainly not something that we want to emulate. And so I feel compelled this morning to take that sense that we have that this is just wrong, and speak today about the law that the Knesset passed a couple of weeks ago on March 30th, known as the death penalty for terrorists law, to which, on its passage, Prime Minister Netanyahu lifted up a bottle of champagne. I will say before I address this that I had great difficulty finding the actual text, the full text of the law as it was passed in the Hebrew. The Knesset website was not accessible. I don't know why. It pulled up saying unavailable, in the location where you are. So I could only find excerpts in the Hebrew and summaries, and there is no official translation into English that has yet been issued. I found an unofficial translation which purports to be the whole thing, but I want to be careful about what I say, because I always like to make sure I'm really grounded on fact, and the text was not available online. But there are certain things that were available and that are very clear and that are in press releases that have been issued by the government. One is that the law provides for death, this is the main piece of it, the law provides for death by hanging, to anyone from the West Bank. In the text of the law, it is from Judea and Samaria, but that is the area that most of the rest of the world calls the West Bank, who commits murder, intentional murder, through terror, but excluding Israeli citizens or residents of Israel. Which means that the impact of the law is that it is designed to apply only to Palestinians or other non-Jews living there, and to exclude Jews and Israeli citizens who may themselves commit murder by acts of terror. This applies only to non-Jews. The other thing about the law is that several procedural protections have been abrogated by this law. I'll just list a couple of them. The execution shall be decreed by and imposed by a military court, not a court of justice in Israel. It shall apply notwithstanding any of the following. It shall not be conditioned on the prosecution having requested the death penalty. The military court can impose it, must impose it, even if the prosecution doesn't ask for it. It does not require a unanimous agreement on the sentence. It does not require that judges on the panel in this military court hold the rank of lieutenant colonel or higher. Low-level officers can be part of the court that determines this. And the commander of the IDF forces in the area, meaning the West Bank, shall not be authorized to mitigate or commute a death sentence imposed on a terrorist convicted here, nor shall the commander be authorized to issue a pardon. That is part of the text of the law. Now, we have to consider this law in connection with Jewish law and Jewish sources and the Jewish tradition. And I want to say that it's important to recognize that Jewish law is ambivalent about capital punishment. The Torah certainly calls for capital punishment by a human court in some cases. The earliest reference in the Torah that I could find is in the aftermath of the flood in Parshat Noach, in chapter 9 of Genesis, in which we are told, Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. Whoever sheds the blood of a human being, their blood shall be shed by a human being. But note that the verse continues, Ki b'tzelem Elohim asat ha'adam. For in the image of God did God make the human being. The indication of the blood for blood is linked to the infinite value of human life, the infinite human dignity of a human being. All human beings universally, this is post-flood, this is pre-Abraham, because all human beings are in the image of God. But there are, of course, numerous texts that follow that speak about the death penalty. The rabbinic tradition severely limited and effectively tried to abolish the death penalty at human hands. They did it by certain evidentiary rules and procedural rules requiring, for example, in capital cases, one can acquit based on the testimony of one eyewitness. But to convict, 2 eyewitnesses to the crime are required. And it can't be hearsay testimony, and it can't be sort of contextual testimony, and examples are given about the testimony that is rejected. If one saw, for example, someone with a bloody knife in their hand and the person on the ground having been stabbed right before them, bleeding out, and there's no one else around, that's not adequate testimony. That's not enough, right? So they really tried to write it out. And most famously, the Mishnah in the tractate known as Makot, which has to do with lashes and punishment, reads as follows. A Sanhedrin that executes one person in 7 years is called destructive. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says 1 in 70 years. If the court executes, invokes the death penalty, capital punishment, once in 70 years, that is a destructive court. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva say, if we had been in the Sanhedrin, no person would ever have been executed. Ever. Right? I think this is the mainstream of Jewish law. It's the mainstream of, certainly, of the rabbinic tradition, a desire to eliminate the death penalty entirely, not by necessarily uprooting it, but by finding ways around it and to say that it never ever applies and should never apply. However, it's important to say this, our tradition is not univocal on this. There are other rabbinic texts that do permit, in certain circumstances, the imposition of capital punishment, as well as medieval texts afterwards that allowed it, and there were a few instances in medieval times where the death penalty was invoked. So we have to acknowledge that Jewish law on capital punishment is complex, right? And there are far too many sources and far too many complexities for a Shabbat morning Devar Torah. I just want to say that the overwhelming weight is that it should never be, but it was not completely eliminated. At the same time, we have numerous texts that say it is possible to be, and one should avoid being, a scoundrel within the bounds of the halakha. Just because the halakha permits, doesn't mean that it's a good thing to do. or the right or just thing to do. And here, with this law in particular, there are other considerations. First of all, the Torah is crystal clear that all should be equal before the law. This is a law that applies only to terrorists who murder who are Palestinian or other non-Jews in the West Bank. It does not apply to settlers who may be committing acts of terror against Palestinians in the West Bank, resulting in death. And we just read on Pesach, Exodus 12, verse 49, there shall be for you one law, Torah achat, for the citizen, Ezrach, and the ger, the stranger who dwells among you. Unless that was insufficiently clear, or one was inclined to get around the meaning of the law by saying, well, there's the citizen and the ger toshav, so we'll exclude the citizen and the toshav, but everybody else we're going to apply this to. In a couple of weeks, we will be reading Leviticus chapter 24, verse 22. You shall have one law, not Torah achat, mishpat echad, legal judgment in the courts for the stranger, the ger, and the citizen alike, kager ka-ezrach, no reference to who dwells where. Why? Ki ani Adonai Elohechem, because I am Adonai your God, which is always brought to things where you might be inclined to find a loophole and do what's wrong because technically you can get away with it. Know that I am watching, right? So that's one thing, that we cannot have a law that applies disparately to different kinds of people in the land. And the second thing is that the Torah is crystal clear that there is a need for a system of justice with procedural safeguards, and especially when human life is at stake. And so we have a text in Masechet Sanhedrin in the Talmud that asks about the imposition of the death penalty, and here's the text. Doesn't Rav Yosef say, and so the school of Chizkiah taught, from the day that the temple was destroyed, although the Sanhedrin ceased to be, the 4 types of court-imposed capital punishment have not ceased. Meaning, even without the Sanhedrin, we still have capital punishment. And the Talmud says, really? Have they not ceased? What do you mean we have capital punishment and no Sanhedrin? They have ceased. No capital punishment after the Sanhedrin has ceased to be. Rather, the din halacha of the 4 types of capital punishment have not ceased. Meaning, we have the halacha of who is obligated for the death penalty. But without a Sanhedrin, human beings do not execute it. And Rashi and other medieval commentators say what it means is now, since we no longer have a Sanhedrin, the death penalty is in the hands of heaven. God will see to it. If someone deserves the death penalty, we leave it to God's hands. We human beings don't do that. Why? Because when the Sanhedrin stood, we had a sense and ability to ensure that there was a high level of learning, of integrity, of seriousness, of responsibility. That's been explicitly abrogated here. We don't have to have high-level officers involved. You don't have to be at the level of lieutenant colonel. Any officer serving in the military can be on a court that decrees the death penalty. What is that? What a gross disregard for the sanctity of life, for due process under law. We don't need it to be unanimous before we take someone's life. Why insist on unanimity, right? This is a violation of everything that the rabbinic tradition understands about the need for a system of justice that is sober, that holds to very high standards, that expresses equality, and that is grounded in the understanding of the infinite preciousness and value of human life. Nothing is more valuable in Jewish law than the value of life. Nothing. There is no greater principle in the Torah. There is nothing in Jewish tradition that ranks higher than human life. We have a text in the Mishnah, in the Sanhedrin, it's in both the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. Why was Adam created alone? Why was the human being created alone? To teach you that anyone who kills one person, who takes one human life, Scripture says about that person as if they had destroyed an entire world, right? A human being, the value of a human being is equal to an entire world. And this is expressed in Yitzhak Greenberg in his book, The Triumph of Life, right? The great contemporary rabbi, Yitzhak Greenberg, who reads the Jewish tradition as being all about the value of life, specifically speaks about the laws of witnessing in a death penalty case. And he says as follows: the climax of life's being more and more like God is the emergence of Homo sapiens, a creature so godlike as to be able to understand God's purposes and plans for creation. Reaching the image of God level of life represents a quantum leap in dignity to which every human being is entitled. I talked about this on the high holidays. These three fundamental dignities that emerge from being created in the image of God. And this is, I'm on page 27. It's the beginning of chapter 2 in his book. He says, in the volume of the Mishnah governing judicial procedures, a passage describing an unusual oath for witnesses in capital cases spells out the enormous value of human life. Reading this passage gives us a window into the three dignities that Judaism sees as intrinsic to every human being. This complex oath ritual was intended to drive home to potential witnesses the weight of a human life. If they understood its extraordinary value, witnesses would strive for absolute precision, restraint, avoidance of hearsay, and so on. The ritual was so awesome, it was intended to be intimidating, as if its purpose were to make people reluctant to testify. It reflects the rabbi's ambivalence about capital punishment, precisely because a human life is so weighty. And that takes us, right, this emphasis on the value of life, chai bahem, right? We should violate halakha rather than die. Life is so weighty. That takes us to the four express purposes of this law that is written into the introduction to the law itself. And here I have what I believe is the Hebrew text of the final law that was passed. And it says specifically that the death sentence is, the purpose of this law is to enact a death sentence for terrorists who have carried out murderous terrorist attacks for the sake, in the service of the struggle against terrorism. And there are four reasons given for this law. One is for the protection of the state of Israel, its citizens, and its residents. The next is for a deterrent effect, to increase and enhance the deterrence of terrorism. The next is the prevention, or the limiting, the desire to prevent hostage-taking attacks. And the last is ugemul al masehem hanifsha'im, for what is best translated as payback. Payback for getting what they are owed, retribution for the heinous acts of terrorists. Those are the reasons given in the law. The first three reasons are really one reason, right? Safety and protection and deterrence of attacks. Those go hand in hand, right? We want to deter so that we'll be safer. In order to be protected, we have to deter and prevent. The death penalty obviously only protects or prevents after the fact, right? So the only way that it protects is through a deterrent effect. Because we're not, right? If we're executing someone, it's because they've already done the thing. So the only possible way that it offers protection is through deterrence. The problem with this, both in Israel and the death penalty here, is there is no credible evidence that capital punishment deters violent crime. Zero. There's no study that has shown that nations or states with the death penalty have lower rates of violent crime or murder. And whatever evidence we have points exactly in the opposite direction. In the United States, statistically, states with the death penalty consistently have higher murder rates than states that do not have the death penalty. And Canada is a good example, because since Canada abolished the death penalty, they've seen a significant decline in murder rates. So it's hard to argue that we can halachically justify the death penalty as a deterrent. Because as a factual matter, that's exceedingly unlikely. And on the whole, it is more likely to increase violent crime and even terrorism. I'll share with you, this is a really wonderful piece that was sent to me, Death Penalty for Terrorists, a Halachic Perspective, by Rabbi Shlomo Brody. Shlomo Brody is the executive director of Ematai and the author of Ethics of Our Fighters, a Jewish View on War and Morality. And he writes as follows, prominent rabbinic authorities, including former chief rabbis Ovadia Yosef and Shlomo Goren, argued that executing terrorists could be halachically permissible and appropriate if it enhances national security during protracted conflict. As Rabbi Itamar War-Haftig emphasizes, however, this depends on security, legal, and political expertise, not textual interpretation. Others add that choosing which terrorists deserve, quote, death could spark heated debates over arbitrary distinctions, diverting attention from broader security priorities. There is also concern that executions may turn terrorists into celebrated martyrs within Palestinian society, potentially fueling future violence. Another motivation for the death penalty proposal is avoiding the release of convicted murderers and lopsided exchanges to release Israeli hostages. From a policy perspective, however, this rationale points elsewhere. If the goal is to prevent dangerous terrorists from returning to killing, the more direct solution is to reform laws governing prisoner swaps and commutations rather than expanding capital punishment. Execution should not substitute for structural improvements to Israel's detention and negotiation policies. Ultimately, Jewish law does not require the execution of terrorists, even the most brutal. It permits it under limited conditions, but demands prudence, proportionality, and sober judgment. The tradition calls not for symbolic or politically driven legislation, but for level-headed, evidence-based decision-making that weighs security outcomes, diplomatic consequences, and moral costs. If military, intelligence, and political experts demonstrate that executions would meaningfully deter terror and strengthen Israel's security, a strong halachic case can be made. Thus far, we don't have that evidence. Otherwise, Jewish law counsels restraint, insisting that justice serve not anger or politics, but the long-term safety and moral integrity of the state. And that takes us to the last point that I want to raise. Because we do not have evidence that this actually serves any of the first three reasons given, the protection of the state of Israel and its citizens, the deterring of terrorism, the stopping of hostage-taking, we have to pay particular attention to the fourth reason that is given: retribution, payback. And that is the very, very worst reason. And I want to say, from a Torah perspective, an unacceptable reason to take a human life. It is contrary to the spirit and overall message of Judaism, as well as particular halachot. The very first murder that takes place in the Torah, Cain kills his brother Abel. And Cain is punished with exile. But God places a sign, an oath, maybe a letter, we don't know, on Cain. Why? The Torah text itself says, this is not midrash, so that none who meet him might kill him. So that none who meet him might kill him. So that the first human being who without cause rose up and killed his brother might not be killed by another human being in vengeance. Later we get the emphasis on the cities of refuge to prevent honor killings, to prevent murder in revenge. The very last thing that Moses did before he died, he was not allowed in the land. The Torah tells us he established those cities of refuge outside the land where he could. The foundation of a healthy society is that we do not exact vengeance. And the law never codifies vengeance. I haven't had a chance to read the whole study. There is an institute at Harvard that has done research on, that is in the process of doing research. Its goal is to research human thriving. What enables human life to thrive? One of the things they've discovered, the societies that are very, very high on forgiveness have the best quality of life, the highest happiness scores, and do the best on all measures of human thriving that we have. Very interesting. I am not suggesting that acts of terror and hostage-taking should be forgiven. Can we forgive the perpetrators of October 7th? Of course not. Forgiveness? No. But vengeance as a cultural thing enshrined in law is the opposite of a culture that understands and values forgiveness. And it leads to a culture of death. It undermines everything we value. I'll close with a little passage that we included in our Siddur. You can see it on page 19. It's a commentary on Psalm 99. Adonai Malach. In the left-hand margin in the middle of the page. In a nomadic society, the strict moral system rested ultimately on the principle of vengeance. When a murder was committed, the relatives of the dead person were enjoined and empowered to act retribution from the killer and his kinsmen. The prophets transformed vengeance into justice, and then proceeded to deepen its meaning to include mercy and loving kindness. These, they taught, were the attributes of God and must govern the relations of men. Robert Gordis. God help us if we abandon justice in the pursuit of retribution.